I want you to move from overwhelmed by information to confident in what really matters. I want to help you move from being unsure towards direction and purpose in your healthcare. I want to introduce you to health experts. I want to let you in on tough conversations on women's health. I want to give you a place where you can lean in and learn how to take care of yourself. Let's transform your health. Let's get clear on your goals. This is Women's Health Unplugged. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Robertson, naturopathic doctor. Welcome to another episode of Women's Health Unplugged. This is a solo. I thought I'd sit down and have a pretty deep conversation about weight management. We've talked about weight management from lots of different angles on the podcast before. And one of my goals with this topic, because it can be such a challenging topic, it's complex, it has emotional triggers for people listening to conversation about weight management. I think that we've been preyed upon. There's a huge commodification of weight management in the health and wellness industry. And so people and women are left feeling very confused about this topic and also, maybe don't understand why they have the goals they have around weight management because, perhaps they feel like they should lose weight or that this goal has been placed upon them, which may not be necessary. We're starting to have conversations about metabolically healthy obesity and whether or not all patients who have a higher BMI need to lose weight to, meet optimal health goals. We're talking about a lot of things when we talk about weight management. But I think what I wanted to chat about and what I thought was kind of a relevant conversation was talking about the consistency of nutrition habits and the influence that that has over time with respect to supporting healthy weight management and weight loss. And specifically sharing, my own journey a little bit through this. And it's a topical for me because I just had to lose some weight to meet a weight class for a weightlifting competition, which, is kind of interesting. It's the first time that I've intentionally tried to lose weight in quite some time. And so I adopted the principles and things that I know that are successful for people. And I wanted to have a good conversation about that and reflect on it because I do think in some of the health and wellness space, we have a lot of rules, we have a lot of should statements, and I wanted you to see an honest, sort of clear process for what that looked like for me to lose 10 pounds. So funnily, when I had lost weight initially, and I had lost some weight, I don't even know how many years ago it was now, to be honest. It took me a long time. So I lost about 12 or 15 pounds, and I was a couple of years into my CrossFit journey. I was exercising a lot, I was getting stronger, but really didn't notice a lot of changes in my body composition through doing all of that. And I didn't understand my nutrition very well. I hadn't been particularly accountable to my nutrition. And remember, I was a practicing naturopathic doctor at this time. I wasn't a 18-year-old clueless human being. I was practicing, and my own personal experience was that, I loved exercise. I definitely have that competitive athlete mentality and drive, but I wasn't seeing change in my body composition. And I was following a really strict low carbohydrate diet at that time. I was following the paleo diet where I ate no grains. Even if a fleck of rice from my daughter's plate landed on my plate, I would flick it off, right? I wouldn't even eat it because I had it in my mind that this was bad. And I thought that I was doing really good things for my body and for weight management. And yet, really zero results to show for it. It was very strong, arguable whether or not I was happy, because I do think my mood struggled at that time as well on that diet, but really struggled from a weight management perspective. So I decided to take a very different approach at that time. Again, I think it was 6 years ago, maybe 7 years ago, and decided to get super accountable with tracking my macronutrients to see where things were at and took a much more balanced approach to my nutrition. And I've talked about this on the podcast before that when I reintroduced carbohydrates into my diet, I literally didn't know how to do it. I would have to eat like 3 cups of popcorn every day after work in order to meet the macronutrient targets that I had set for myself, because it wasn't just naturally part of my life to eat those carbs. Anyways, I did this process 6 years ago, and that's really one of the last times I've had some intentional weight loss periods over the last 6 years since that time. But one of them was to make weight for a powerlifting competition. One of them was a really sort of short attempt at adjusting body weight when things had, maybe changed a little bit for me in a direction I didn't want to go in. But really, it's like over 6 years, I had 3, including this last one, intentional weight loss phases, whereas the rest of the time I've been pretty happy in maintenance or slight surplus to accommodate for my training and mood. And there's moments where it has not been particularly important to me to be a particular body weight, and I've been much more interested in things like performance and mood. But so it's maybe 3 times that I've done this 12 weeks of food tracking over a 6-year window of time. And I want to make that super clear, because one of the challenges I see when I work with patients is that they are in a perpetual state of attempting to diet. And I do think that that has lots of negative implications. There's certainly conversations about what that does from a metabolic perspective, and definitely there is some downregulation of metabolism when patients diet over and over again or for long windows of time. But I also think from a psychological perspective, it does a couple of negative things. I think we can lose touch with the accuracy at which we execute our diet when we say in our mind, well, I'm dieting, I'm always dieting, I'm always in calorie restriction. But the length of time that you're able to do the things that maybe are necessary to get into a calorie restriction, there is a timeline on that. You can't do that stuff indefinitely. You can't. I mean, maybe you think you can, but I've yet to meet a patient who can just consistently hammer out caloric restriction based habits when that's not their natural body, if they were just left out in the wild. And so for me, if I leave my appetite and mood up to making decisions about food, I fuel more than what it takes for me to lose the 10 pounds that I need to for this weightlifting competition. It's very difficult for patients to do the continuous repetition of habits necessary to be in a fat loss phase. And so, although, yes, your metabolism does change in a negative direction if you're constantly under fueling or in a calorie deficit, there is also, and what I actually think, and this is totally my opinion, I think the psychological implications of constantly striving for a caloric deficit are actually one of the limiters for that long-term success. So if you're listening to this and you're like, I've been dieting for 2 years, I want you to take a really hard look at that and maybe chat with someone about what the benefit of doing some maintenance, some reverse dieting might be for you, just from not just a metabolism perspective, but from a psychological perspective. There's definitely more outcomes that we care about in health than just weight on the scale. And we've talked about that a lot on the podcast. And so I'm making it really clear when I talk about performance, mood, and body weight. For me, those are 3 different categories. And I think performance and mood can hang out in the same category. And if I'm fueling well and a lot and really mindful of my nutrition from a performance-based perspective, my mood is quite good. When I'm in a calorie deficit, my mood is not as good. And so I do think that, we have to always consider how long we're in each of these goals and looking at the big picture, long game with our health. And so when I talk about, in air quotes, me losing 10 pounds, I want you to remember that I haven't done that in at least 3 years, because it was pre-COVID was the last time, and the previous time before that was 6 years. Actually, it's almost 7 years now that I think about it. So 3 times in 6-ish years, doing a 12-week intentional caloric restriction. That's what it looks like. It does not look like consistent dieting. And so I just want that to be really clear. So I find caloric restriction for the purpose of making weight for a weight loss competition like reasonably easy. And part of the rationale there, in my mind at least, is that I have an end date. I have a date that I'm working towards, and I can quite easily do the math on how many days need to be pretty good, how many days can be mediocre, how many days I can totally blow it. And also I can see the end in sight, so that end date creeps closer and closer. What I find for patients when they're working into the abyss of forever is that goal is not really close enough. Like, forever is not a tangible goal. And so again, when you imagine yourself being in a calorie deficit and you say, I'm going to do this forever, I'm going to eat no bagels forever, or whatever it is, that is not, like, psychologically, that's just not something that we can hold up. And so I find it reasonably easy, because when I've done intentional weight loss phases, there's always been an end date that I've had in the calendar. It must be by this time. And so I'm sure some would argue that puts like unnecessary or undue pressure on the execution of all of the habits. But I also think that it's a more tangible goal than working into the abyss. And I have recommended to patients before, when they say, I'm going to reward myself when I lose 10 pounds. I actually encourage them to reward themselves when they've completed the plan for 10 weeks instead. Because again, like the weight loss for weightlifting is a little different. I'm going into my last week still 3 pounds over the weight that I need to be, and we will water manip so that on the scale I will appear the weight that we need to in order for me to make the weight cut. But when we're talking about in the real world, a woman and person's body, especially under the influence of hormones, is going to fluctuate a pound up or down quite a bit. And so again, I need you to be really mindful of what we're actually tracking and what outcome you think you actually are moving towards, because I actually just think doing the intentional habits that help support weight loss for 12 weeks is a great goal. And regardless of what the outcome is at the end of that 12 weeks, if you don't need to make weight for a weightlifting competition, then maybe we don't really care what weight you are at the end of this phase, right? So just food for thought. So that's sort of like, that was a huge preamble around the context. You can see how uncomfortable it is to have this conversation. And it's not because I feel uncomfortable talking about my weight or weight management. I actually take quite a pragmatic and very logical approach to weight management for myself. Certainly have some of those emotional hang-ups and body image challenges and some dysmorphia. I don't deny that. But I also feel like I'm separate enough from that emotional relationship with food and weight that I can always talk about my weight and fueling really pragmatically. And I've commented on this before, like I find it funny when, in the weightlifting world, we all talk about our weight and age, like really practically, because they're just the like absolute realities of the sport. Whereas if you took that same conversation and put it in a cafe, right, like people would be appalled that we're talking about how old are you and how much do you weigh. But I can definitely have that very like logical approach to having this conversation. So for sure, like if you're sitting there listening and this is really triggering for you, I would highly suggest that you stop listening or put it down until you feel like you can kind of hold your own health out in front of you at arm's length and look at it a little differently than feeling like your weight is something that's a part of you, or that it says something about you, or that it's about your self-worth. You need to be able to hold all of that stuff out at arm's length and say, like, what's my caloric intake? What are my habits? What are my goals? Why are those my goals? And if you can have that real honest conversation with yourself, and at the end of the day, you're still like, no, I'd like to lose weight. Insert whatever reason you feel is relevant to that. That's okay, right? As long as we're not sort of crossing that line of disordered eating. And I think that's where we struggle with this conversation, because it's like, well, where do we draw that line, right? Are people allowed to want to lose weight? And I'd like to imagine, or I like to live in the gray, where it's completely possible that is a totally appropriate health goal for you. Right? That is okay if that is your health goal. I also am incredibly mindful of why that's someone's health goal, and want to make sure that it's for good reason and not destructive reason. So how did I do it? So basically, part of what prompted me wanting to do this podcast is because that first time that I lost weight, 7 years ago, I posted about it on Instagram. Not at that time. I was not an Instagrammer at that time, but I posted about it at some point. And the number of comments that I got on the post about how I had done my weight loss incorrectly actually stuck with me because it showed me or reminded me just what we're up against when it comes to educating people about like nutrition and diet culture and all of that shit. Because what I said in my post was that it took me 100 days of tracking my food and logging my food to lose 10 pounds. And that was what happened the first time I did it. It was over a summer. I was really meticulous about my food, partly because I had like deep interest in how this worked, that I could eat carbohydrates and lose weight, since I had kind of previously ascribed to the idea that carbs were terrible. And turns out they're the best. But anyways, I had posted that it took me 100 days to lose 10 pounds. And the comments that I got in the feed, which were interestingly posted by nutritionists and people who were trying to sell weight loss products, they all said that I had done it wrong because it shouldn't have taken me 100 days to lose 10 pounds. And I was like, okay, well, that's interesting. And then part of me went like, well, maybe I was being a baby about it. Like maybe I did do it wrong. Except at the end of that initial fat loss phase, I actually maintained my weight. Not as low as my lowest, because that just wasn't the right weight for me. My performance in the gym was really poor. My coach at the time was like, Jordan, you're useless in the gym. Like, you look scrawny. This isn't working for us. And so I actually rebounded up a little bit because it was better from a performance perspective. But I actually maintained that weight for about 4 years, where things had slowly crept back up. But again, with performance metrics, my body fat percentage remained the same or leaner. It's just I was heavier because I was eating more and I was training a lot. And I was generally just heavier going into that 4th year. And that's when I decided to compete in powerlifting, and I needed to lose, again, I think it was about 8 or 9 pounds at the time to make weight for a powerlifting competition. And I had to get quite lean for me in order to do that. And then entered another 12-week, it might have been 16-week, but 12 or 16-week, intentional fat loss phase. And that was in 2019. The competition was in April of 2020. And so it actually was canceled, and I never... or actually the competition was in December of 2019. And then I was going to compete for real in April of 2020, and it was canceled because of COVID. And so when I did that initial weight loss, I maintained it. And so interestingly, looking back on those comments of well, you did it wrong. You shouldn't have, it shouldn't have taken you this long to lose the weight. The part of the rationale for me wanting to have this conversation is I wanted to share with you the difference between, that sustainable change, weight loss that can be kept off versus those comments on my Instagram that were like, I could help you lose 10 pounds in 6 minutes if you just bought my special product. So I wanted to share this conversation. And then when I recently needed to cut weight again for an Olympic lifting competition, I thought this was a great time to talk about some of those habits and things that I ended up adopting in order to, over another 12-week window of time, lose 10 pounds. Now, you're probably mentally trying to do the math and being like, well, what happened there? Literally what happened between the last powerlifting competition and now. But it was COVID. So the weightlifting competition I was supposed to do, or the powerlifting competition I was supposed to do in April 2020, when that got canceled and the gym was closed and our lives got turned upside down, I really did not exercise for about a year. I had some sporadic moments where I tried to return to the gym. I walked a lot and really enjoyed my walking time with my dog. But all in all, there was not a lot of exercise, a lot of eating my feelings. The roles in my family changed. So I was working out of the home and my husband was doing all of the cooking. And that role reversal really affected my nutrition and caloric intake, not because he made terrible meals. He made wonderful meals. They just were not always with the same nutritional habits that I would have done if I had been cooking the meal. And that by consequence, doing that, 5 days a week over a year, plus not exercising, plus having all the stress of COVID, I did gain about 10 pounds through COVID. And so when I went to wanting to step back on the platform, I was kind of staring down the barrel of needing to lose 12 or 13 pounds in order to make weight for a competition. So that's where that impetus actually came from. And, I truly, when I went back to exercise after COVID and have been training really regularly in the gym, I still didn't have any particular interest in going into any kind of weight loss phase because my goal was just to have good performance and a good mood. And so coming out of COVID for me, I knew that my body had changed, but I wasn't particularly interested in doing anything about it. And partly because there's side effects of dieting. And I think that's something that we don't talk about enough. But it's funny because the number one reason why I see women is fatigue in their mood. I guess those are two reasons. Number two most common reasons why I see women is fatigue and their mood. And the two most common side effects from dieting are fatigue and a low mood. And so for me, there's been lots of moments in my last couple of years where it just would have been intolerable for me to be tired, and it would have been intolerable for me to be suffering with my mood. And so I just was not interested in going through that and suffering those side effects. And I'm not saying it's possible for you to be in a calorie deficit and not have those side effects. But you have to be pretty mild at your plan of attack. And I think that's where we make lots of mistakes when it comes to dieting, is that we go so hard and have significant restriction, and that then influences how we feel, which then causes people to quit their plan. This is where that I did it for 100 days and someone said I did it wrong this is where that whole mindset kind of diverges, is that for me, and I saw this online and I thought it was such a great quote. It was basically saying that we really want to feed people as much as humanly possible and meet their goals. And so the goal isn't to eat as little as possible. The goal is to eat as much as possible while still hitting your goals. And if your goals have some weight loss, then we want to eat as much as possible in a calorie deficit, not as little as possible. And that's what gets us the lack of fatigue while we're pursuing those health goals that you have. So this last episode of weight management is tough because it was done in the winter months. And so it's hard for me to get enough outdoor exercise and walking time to help support the cardio aspect of my weight loss. And it was generally a very busy season for me. So this time of year is particularly busy. I don't take enough vacation between January and May. And so to be have a high intensity program, high intensity focus on nutrition, and because really losing weight is probably a 10-hour a week part-time job. And so to add that to this time of year was not particularly easy for me. Whereas in previous times that I've done a fat loss phase, it was either in the spring, summer, or in the early fall where my workload is actually a little lighter. So this was actually my busiest time of year, and probably some of the habits that I adopted are a reflection of that. I didn't do a lot of baking, and the first time I lost weight, I did a lot of low-fat muffins and a few staples that I could have so that and meet my goals. I could have anything, but something I could have but meet my goals. I did way more cooking the first couple times that I did it, but with this particular time, I didn't really have the bandwidth to do additional cooking, and so a lot of my habits and the changes that I made were a reflection of how busy I was. But it also is quite it's interesting to do that kind of plan when you don't really have the time, because you have to prioritize it and you have to be a little bit, have some forethought and plan ahead. So the way that I approach this is, I need to use an app in order to track my food. It just, the eyeballing or the honor system doesn't really work for me. I can't do the mental math. And when I do the mental, and I'm incredibly good at looking at a plate and saying, okay, well, that's 475 calories. I can do the mental math. It's the accountability and the emotion around the mental math that's something that I'm not capable of doing, nor do I want to do. And so I use an app in order to track my food intake. Now, I realize that that does not work for everyone. And we've actually done an entire episode on whether or not tracking macronutrients is something that you should even bother with. The reason that I find it beneficial for myself is that it actually gives me some insight into the patterns that I've adopted with my nutrition over time. So, for example, a oatmeal and Greek yogurt and apple and cinnamon may slowly evolve to a oatmeal with a scoop of almond butter and ground flax and a handful of pumpkin seeds and apple and maple syrup. Now, both of those are delicious. One of them is not going to move me towards my goal. And so I use tracking to help me get reoriented with the meals that I'm having to make sure that they're still meeting my needs and that there haven't been small behavior adjustments over time that have put me off the path that I wanted to be on from a weight loss perspective. And it also helps me see where some of the pain points are in the meals that I've created. So, my family loves gnocchi. We make a lot of gnocchi. But when you start to plug things into apps, you start to go, okay, well, maybe gnocchi needs to be like, twice a month instead of every week, where we got into like a really decent habit of making gnocchi quite a bit. It also shows me some pain points of like some of the condiment use that I have. So the free-flowing salad dressing and the mayonnaise that I measure with my heart, again, not on the path. And so it would allow me, when I do the tracking, it allows me to see that like there are some opportunities that I could make some adjustments in. But mostly it does give me that, initially when I start tracking, it gives me that reorienting with how my meals have shifted and evolved over time, just with changes in behavior and changes in pattern of eating. When I had to macro track some of the meals that my husband was making, when I had to ask him like, how much olive oil did you use in this? He cooks with a lot of olive oil and it just was not meeting my nutrition needs. So that's, for me, that's one of the big initial goals when I'm adding in tracking. But the other piece is that it helps me see the like ebb and flow of days, meals, and then weeks. So it's easy to be over, on my fueling once a week for going out for dinner with my family. And actually through my entire weight loss phase, I still went out for dinner at least once a week. So there was always one meal per week that was really, not on the path, saying in air quotes, of helping with weight loss. But when I could see that one day over the course of 7 as the one that was standing out, it became the minority, right? It became the 1 out of every 7. But when I'm not tracking and having an intentional goal, eating out maybe happens every 5 days instead of every 7. And that may not really, you may not even notice that that's happened. But then when we look at those ratios of 1 to 5, one every 5 days is not moving you towards your goal versus 1 out of every 7, that's going to change your trajectory. And for me, even tracking some of those days where we had all you can eat sushi, or we went to a restaurant and I ordered tacos, or I Uber Eats to the office, that's in there. So I start initially to reorient myself, but then the continuation of tracking for me is about how do I look at these like average patterns over time, and are there opportunities for me to make adjustments in my like weekly pattern and in my monthly pattern. It's interesting. So many patients, when I work with them, they say this exact phrase: if I could just make it through a weekend, I bet I could hit my goals. And they're not wrong, actually. For me, when I track, like the weekends are the hardest part because I'm home and everybody's there and we have different food and I'm like a foot from the chip container. Those are harder days for me, but that actually makes it more important that those days are paid attention to, again, when I have a specific goal. Again, I'm not suggesting that we need to track all the time. I'm talking about for like an actual intensive purpose here, that's something that's really supportive. So that's one of my, hacks, or one of my tips. But remember, like I did that for for 3 months. It was really almost over 3 months. And opening that app every single day, like I find it challenging because I don't like to be around my phone that much. And so I found it challenging, and I'm sure my social media time went up because I was tracking my food. I didn't like having it in and around the dinner table and whatnot, and it is just frustrating to have to track all the time. But it's that accountability piece that is hard for me to replicate in other ways, and because I don't like food rules, I wanted to have a Domino's pizza dinner date with a Diet Coke with my husband when my kids were at a sleepover, and we did, and I made it fit. And so for me, tracking actually allows me to have that flexibility with my nutrition rather than creating a whole bunch of rules. So that's my first hack. My second actually is going to fly in the face of most wellness culture is that I look for lower calorie or lower fat options of some of my really common food staples. So I mentioned mayonnaise. I actually eat low fat mayonnaise when I'm working through a fat loss phase. And I know it's not as good. It's kind of gross. No, I cannot pronounce some of the ingredients on the label, but it's a tablespoon. I'm pretty sure that the tablespoon of chemical frozen egg whites is not going to kill me, and it's helping me achieve my overall goal. Sometimes in the wellness space, we talk about whole foods and whole fats and whole this and whole that, and don't bastardize the oil by using too little. Don't bastardize the mayonnaise by having low fat. How dare you use dehydrated peanut butter powder? You should just eat the real thing. But the reality is that none of those things eaten to my heart's content are actually going to help support my weight loss goal. And so by making those simple flips to low-fat cream cheese, low-fat salad dressing, low-fat mayonnaise, peanut butter, a PB2 or a dehydrated peanut butter product, I probably saved myself in the neighborhood of about 300 calories per day, right? If I think about the frequency that I'm having some of those foods, having each of those things be replacements in my day-to-day pattern of eating, it's about 300 calories that I would be saving. And so those simple swaps, low-fat dairy, low-fat cheese, I use low-fat Havarti. It still tastes pretty good. It's a significant impact on my caloric intake. Now, if I ate those things and I was remarkably satisfied by the full-fat version and that prevented me from eating later, great. But for me, having a slice of low-fat Havarti cheese has the same satiety as having a full-fat slice of Havarti cheese. And so I choose the low-fat one because that's just the right choice during this phase of my health plan. But partly why I'm sharing these low fat, low calorie hacks, I also drank a lot of Diet Coke, is because I think that, it's interesting to watch the trends in the nutrition and wellness culture. We've kind of villainized a lot of these things. We've villainized meal replacement. We've villainized low fat options. We've villainized aspartame. We've villainized other things that truly can be a healthy part of a weight loss solution for some patients. I was not drinking 20 Diet Coke per day. I had maybe one per week, maybe two, on some weeks that I was really struggling with my, food cravings, or where I, felt like I needed something, sweet to be added to my meal in order for me to feel satisfied by what I was eating. I continued to eat almost the exact same lunch that I was eating pre-fat loss phase, just swapping out the avocado, swapping in some low-fat mayo, using some Dijon mustard as a 0-calorie condiment in my chicken salad. These are not detrimental changes, and yet often I feel like because we've really created this morality around food choices is that people can feel bad about making that selection when it might actually be what you need. When I work with women one-on-one, honestly, the number that they're the least connected to in their nutrition is how much fat they eat. And actually, that's in the research as well. Patients know approximately how much protein they're eating. They don't know how much protein they need. And so that's the gap, right? Patients are surprised they need so much protein, but they can point to the things on their plate that are protein. But we probably also point to peanut butter and call that protein. We point to a croissant and call that a carb. We point to nuts and we might call that, we don't even really know what we call that, truthfully. And all three of those are really significant impacts on the amount of fat that we're eating in a day. It's the macro that we are the least connected to and we're the least likely able to point to on our plate. And so for many patients, that low fat selection in those condiments, their creamer, their dairy choices, their soda, well, that's not low fat, but low calorie, you know what I mean? Those actually might help tip the scale, no pun intended, in the direction that they're hoping to move. And yet, for some reason, we've created this weird morality around choosing a low fat or low calorie option as if that's going to do more harm than you continuing to not meet your goal. So I want you to feel a little bit more confident and a little bit less shame around choosing some of those options. And often once I've completed a weight loss phase, which we'll talk about that in a second, I will maintain some of those low-fat options for quite some time, often until the condiment runs out, and then I maybe would just eat what my family normally eats if I'm not needing to be particularly intentional about it. Sometimes those choices for me switch based on the season, just because my activity level goes up quite a bit in the summer with outdoor walking. And so I can, I'm saying in air quotes, can choose differently in the summer or cannot worry about it. And whereas in the winter months, maybe I would be slightly more mindful of because my movement has changed. And so that math equation for me gets a little poorer in the winter. So I just want you to feel, or just want you to understand that that is how I did it. That's literally why I'm sharing, because I do see so much conversation online about how those choices are bad, and they aren't. They're not bad if they help you achieve your goal. If you're drinking a gallon of mayonnaise, low-fat mayonnaise every day, then let's talk. But my guess is that's not happening. And there's some neat research on this, like what happens if we feed patients back a little bit of cheese on their restrictive diet? What happens if we let patients put some Parmesan on the food that they're eating? What happens if and we've tried to test a lot of these things. And truthfully, if we allow some either salt replacement or lower fat options or some kind of wiggle room on nutrition plans, the compliance actually goes up significantly. So for me, if I was going to say, okay, well, you can't have mayonnaise, Jordan, because it doesn't fit, and there's no other alternative, then I'm less likely to keep going, because dry tuna salad is just not a thing in my world. So I wanted you to know and kind of understand that piece. The other hack, or the last hack that I want to share before we talk a little bit about water and body weight, is I had everyone in my family on board with what I was going through and what I was doing. I kind of mentioned earlier, my husband cooks with a lot of olive oil, but we talked about what needed to happen over Really, I didn't kind of recruit him into the conversation until I was maybe about 8 weeks out. The first 4 or 5 weeks, I kind of cruised along on my own, served my own plate of dinner, just moved around some of the patterns that were happening in my house. But I also at that time was not too concerned about being under or over on my caloric intake on any particular day, because on average, I was doing relatively well through the week. We never altered where we were going to eat for dinner if we were going out. We didn't alter any meals for me. We still made, I still had a hamburger. I still had all the things that my family was eating. It wasn't until we got about 8 weeks out that I really needed to get a bit more serious about just the consistency that I was kind of executing my nutrition. But I talked really clearly with my husband and my whole family, actually. Eventually, the kids even knew at the end what I was working towards. And they had lots of questions about like why was I able to eat Easter eggs and whatnot, and just talking about overall nutrition, which I found was actually quite a healthy conversation. I think sometimes we talk about nutrition and with our kids as maybe being a negative thing, but it was important for them to see that I was intentionally choosing vegetables, that I was intentionally making some decisions about my food for a period of time. And then we celebrated with like a big sushi dinner when it was all over. So, but by talking to my partner about it, it actually helped me stay more connected to my goals. And so there's a great quote that says, "We would rather be the same than be right," where if we're in a community and that community is doing something that is really not right for us, we as humans generally will choose sameness over correctness, right? If we see everybody eating, ice cream after dinner, if we see everybody not going for a walk, if we see everybody having a glass of wine and we're trying to stay sober, it's really hard for us to choose differentness, even if it's correctness for our particular plan. And so one of the things that makes the biggest difference for me, as well as for patients when I watch them do some intentional nutrition changes, is to actually have a good conversation with your partner and family about what you're doing and to help you stay accountable. So once I talked to my husband about it, I was like, you know what, I really need to get into this weight class. This is what it's going to take. This is where I need your help. He got me, dessert from the store that was going to meet my needs. He would already cook a chicken burger if everybody else was having burgers and I was getting home late. He would ask if the meal that he had on deck was going to meet my needs. And even though I barely ever deviated from our family meals, actually, I just even had a slight variation most of the time, but almost never did I have something completely different than what my family was eating for dinner. It was having him ask that actually helped support me in my consistency, because I knew that we were kind of like on this little path together, and my needs were being thought of and accounted for in the overall ebb and flow of the week. And so they started having gnocchi when I wasn't there. They started, saving some of those meals that were just straight up not going to meet my needs, or, having them when I wasn't there. And then when I got home late, I was able to kind of self-serve and decide, okay, well, that meal is not totally fitting what my goals are. I'll take the chicken and I'll make a salad with it instead of having it, in the pasta or what have you, whatever they had made. But that accountability and having the support makes a huge difference. And it's interesting because when I read intake forms from patients, quite often people will say that their partner is their greatest source of support. And yet, that person is also the person who's the most likely to eat a bag of chips in front of you, who's the most likely to whine if you make a dinner that, they don't like, or is to roll their eyes when you don't eat what they made for dinner. And so even though we cite that person as being the most likely to support us on an intake form at the doctor's office, the question is whether or not, when push comes to shove, if they really are able to put down some of their own thoughts about your health journey, some of their own thoughts about their own health journey, and to really sit with you in a lot of the discomfort, because it is uncomfortable to change your grocery shopping, to change the time of when you eat dinner, to change the side dish that you always have with pork chops. There is discomfort, and you need the people in your life to, at the very least, not sabotage what it is that you're doing. And so that made a remarkable difference for me. So that's literally how I did it. It was tracking. It was simple swaps, right, which saved me lots of caloric intake. Yes, I increased my cardio a little bit, especially towards the end. But honestly, because of the season that I was doing this in, I really just had to replace the outdoor walking that I would have maybe done in another season. So when I finished a lot of my workouts, I walked on the treadmill at the gym for an additional 20 minutes. I used my Peloton on all of my rest days. I walked on all my rest days. And it wasn't really until the last 2 weeks or so where I took the cardio And I never ran. Let's be real. There was no like high intensity cardio. It was all walking, slow biking, or like a pretty easy Peloton class. I never in the 3 months that I was working towards this beat my previous Peloton best 30-minute class. It was not the intention of me using the Peloton, nor was I in the most energetic state for me to beat my previous record. It's interesting. We can't always hold every goal in our hand at the same time. And so I was never going to like sit down on the Peloton and like totally kill my previous 30 minutes because I had made that record when I was incredibly well fueled and I wasn't training for the competition. And so I did do some increase in exercise, but it was all like in context of what the ultimate goal was. I never confused my cardio with what the main goal actually was. I just kept it for what it was, which was like additional minutes of movement per day, period. My preference is to do outdoor walking, but when I couldn't, or when I had some spare moments, my son takes a CrossFit class twice a week. When I was there and didn't have training to do and I was just waiting for him, I just walked on the treadmill. So that was how I added things in the last couple of weeks in order to increase my energy expenditure. But I never got my heart rate up above like 100 because that's not, I wasn't able to like push out the number of minutes of cardio that I wanted to do. And also I didn't want to get depleted when I had other more important things going on, like managing my nutrition as well as my other training. I actually started recording this episode before my competition, and my thought pattern there was, okay, well, let's talk about the positive aspects of the what you achieved, and it doesn't matter if you made weight or not. This is what I was thinking when I originally started recording it. But that week before got a little hectic, as you can imagine, and my bandwidth was taken up by lots of things. And so I actually have had to record the second half of this podcast after the competition. And so my original thought was like, okay, don't make this outcome oriented, Jordan, like just record. And it's nice. And talking about how you've shifted your nutrition in the last 3 months to support healthy weight loss is a really positive thing. But then now that I've been through the other side of the competition, I want to add one more little piece to this conversation. And I know this is a really long episode, so I hope that you stay till the end. So I want to talk a little bit about the impact of things on the scale. And one of the challenges I have when working with patients, men and women, is that like your weight on the scale fluctuates a ton. And if you've ever tracked it like unemotionally for a period of time, you would see that your body weight fluctuation is up and down and all over the place. And until you track really diligently over time and start to like make every day's data point less relevant, right? If you only step on one day, that's 100% of your information. If you get on 2 days, I mean, each day is still weighing in really significantly on how you feel about it. If you have 120 touch points, suddenly each and every single day starts to become less relevant. And what I find, and when working with patients, is that they basically live and die every day with what it says on the scale. But the number of things that impact like that number, it's such a crude number measuring your health. And it's not a good measure of your health. And we've talked about that on other episodes before. When we look at, the impact of constipation or the impact of hydration, or if you had a salty meal the night before or a pretty carby meal the night before, not bad. Your water weight is going to change and you'll be heavier the day after. But when we don't understand these things, patients do feel like they gain and lose all of that weight as fat going up and down. It's adiposity, negative for their health and contrary to their goals. When you can be losing unhealthy fat or abdominal fat while the scale doesn't change, you can recompensate you can have body recomposition, meaning that you're gaining muscle mass while losing fat, even though the scale doesn't change. You can have days where you're hitting it out of the park and nailing your goals and you're going to weigh in heavy. And so there's nothing that teaches you quite as much about the impact of stuff on the scale as doing a cut for a competition. And this is the second time, actually I'm going to call it the third time that I've done a water cut. when you see athletes, when you see, everyone thinks about the MMA fighters, right? But there's lots of weight class sports. You probably are seeing this in, when you see models or when you see other fitness industry type pictures online. You're seeing where people have manipulated their water to look leaner, to look more cut. And they've done it in a way that has nothing to do with their actual body weight or their actual fat mass. And the couple of times that I've done this has actually taught me a lot about how little faith to put in the scale. And I actually wish that everyone understood and knew this part. So basically on the Thursday, so my competition was on Saturday. So the week leading up, we knew I was over. I was about 3.5 pounds over on the Sunday before the competition. And I had goals of trying to cut down below that going into that last week so that I didn't feel stressed about it, but turns out that was not the case. And I was still 3.5 pounds over the weight that I needed to be on the platform with about 6 days to go. And so we used a water cut, which starts with some really intentional overhydration. So Monday to Thursday was a progressive overload of water where I drank liters and liters and liters of water every day and really in excess of what would be considered to be healthy. And the goal of that is actually to create a dilution effect in your blood. You don't feel good. Those last couple days, you feel waterlogged, you feel pretty disgusting. And then you start to manipulate your nutrition and your water in the last 48 hours going into the competition. So you cut out all water almost, with the exception of some sips here and there on the day before. So on the Friday, I had special weighed out meals that consisted of very little carbohydrate, some protein. I ate candy because candy was a very light food. So the food itself has to be light. So I ate very light, calorie dense food like candy, not joking. Cut water down to barely enough to get through the day, essentially. And so even though 48 hours prior to the competition, I was still over, I was still 2.5 pounds over, we manipulated my body water with that process. But in addition to that, had to use laxatives because my digestion was completely effed from that situation. I had to sweat. And so there was intentional hot tub, hot shower, wrap in blankets and clothing in order to sweat out additional water. And then on the morning of, I still weighed in heavy at home. And so had zero fluid, chewed gum so that I didn't hate my life, and drove to the competition. And about 2 hours later, weighed in accurately. That was how I cut the last 2.5-ish, almost 3 pounds. It was literally just through manipulating body water. And I've done it other times, and there's other ways of doing it. And it's not healthy. It is not a thing that you should aspire to do. There's other times that I've, gained and lost many, many pounds of fluid for various reasons, usually for weight class sports stuff. The interesting thing is, and so I made weight on the Saturday morning for the competition, and I'm talking about no fluid, a dry Advil getting lodged in my esophagus kind of no fluid, because my 40-year-old body needs an anti-inflammatory in order to perform. That's what it was. And so the headache, the dehydration, the fatigue, all of the pieces that came from that, I felt exactly how you imagine that I would feel. I couldn't stop thinking about food. I had to go for a walk the morning of to try and just kill time. Every hour was the longest year of my life waiting for the weigh-in on the Saturday morning. So Saturday morning, I weighed in at the appropriate weight. And then by Sunday morning, I was 3.5 pounds heavier. glycogen replenishment, rehydration, overfueling, absolutely, because we 100% celebrated the night before. But over a 48-hour period, I gained and lost approximately 7-ish pounds. Now, that's happening in most people's lives, not to such a dramatic effect, but that learning moment here is that between your hormones and your stool in your colon and the amount of fluid that you have in your body and the amount of glycogen that's in your muscles, there are many, many things that contribute to the numerical value that's on the scale when you get on it that has nothing to do with your progress, nothing to do with your nutrition choices, nothing to do with anything. It's just regular, natural manipulation of body fluid. And so if you're that person who's like living and dying with getting on the scale every morning and it's dictating how you feel in the day, how you feel about yourself. Maybe it's impacting your food choices because you get on the scale and you're a half a pound heavy than you were yesterday and you're like, well, fuck it, like doesn't matter. Throw in the towel. That's not actually what's happening. The fluctuations you see day to day are 100% fluid. The fluctuations you see week to week might be starting to show some change in body weight. The fluctuations you see month to month is where you see the change you're looking for. And so that checking every day only works if you're able to put down the emotion and actually just get truly curious about what's happening in your body. We knew that the competition was in my luteal phase, which is my PMSy fluid-filled phase of my cycle. When I reached out to a colleague of mine and said, and she works with weight class athletes, and I was like, shit, the competition's in my luteal phase and I'm still 2.5 pounds over. Her response was like, do you have any diuretics? Right? Because we know that females will retain water during half of their cycle. And as a weight class athlete, that's a really difficult thing to manage. It's a whole other aspect to the sport of trying to manage body water. But you're doing that every day, whether you're a weight class athlete or not. This is having a significant impact on that weight on the scale. And so I want you to have that high curiosity and high compassion when you're using that as a measurement that you're checking in with, because my guess is it's not a reflection of what you think. So now I'm 2 days out. I'm back up to my probably natural weight of being about 4 pounds heavy from where I cut to 2 days ago. I feel super energetic. When I was driving to work this morning, I was like, why do I feel so good? Why do I have so much energy to go record the rest of this podcast? And it's because there's better fueling. I'm rehydrated. The glycogen stores are up and I'm back up at my normal body weight and feel pretty good. And so I wanted to be able to share that now that I, screwed up my time management and ended up having to record the second half of this after my competition. I wanted you to hear that follow-up aspect to it, because it really can teach you a lot about your body, but also to help you feel less emotionally connected to that weight on the scale. Because where my progress really was in the 11 weeks leading up to those last 48 hours, not the 48 hours where I got down to my lowest weight. That is not a true reflection of my health in this moment. If anything, that's the worst that I've felt in the last 12 weeks was on that day. So I'm excited about my future in weightlifting. I'm excited to get back to work, but I'm also excited to widen my nutrition flexibility a little bit over the next few months. So hopefully that was a helpful episode for you to hang out with. And if you've got follow-up questions, reach out. We've got lots of ways to support you. I hope you enjoyed that episode of Women's Health Unplugged. My goal is to help you feel more confident about your health. Please remember that what we talked about today in the podcast does not constitute medical advice, nor was a doctor-patient relationship formed. If you have questions about your healthcare or about how today's topic pertains to you, please take it up with your family doctor, your specialist, or someone on your health team.